Hi friends, we're now here to talk about the books that I read in June of 2023. So we'll kick things off with a short story collection that I really enjoyed, and that is the Tangleroot Palace, which is by Marjorie Liu. In all fairness, I was sort of tempered in terms of my expectations when it came to this short story collection. I generally feel like most short story collections have wound up being sort of a mixed bag for me, right? But this one I really liked. I think the author's writing style just really works well for me. It flows really well. She has just the right amount of description for my personal taste. I really love that there was a variety in the characters, the plots, the themes, and the way that fairy tale vibe was woven into it. Love that. So this is definitely a collection that's earned a place on my shelves, and I loved it way more than I anticipated. The next book I want to talk about is a romance, and that is The 7-Year Slip, which is by Ashley Poston. Ashley Poston always has such interesting premises for her novels, and this one was no exception. I enjoyed a lot about this one, particularly the magical apartment that lets, these two characters sort of travel through a time slip. The New York setting, which was fun. I love reading books set in New York, especially when I feel like they capture the vibe of the city in a way I've experienced. The inclusion of food and book publishing, everything about this just felt very cozy to read, and I really needed that vibe at the time that I picked it up, which is why I enjoyed it. The one thing that didn't quite stick the landing for me was the actual romance itself. I could buy the instant attraction, and I could buy the sort of friendship that strikes up between the two characters, but the depth of their feelings for one another generally just didn't always ring true to me. That said, I did find it very satisfying to see how Clementine's story was wrapped up by the end of this one. And then I read a novella, The Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson, which is a novella in the world of the Sorcery of Thorn series. And it was just nice to be able to step back into a world that I enjoyed and to be with characters I liked, specifically Elizabeth, Nathaniel, and their companions. It was just a lovely little addition to the world that read very quickly. It was cozy and fluffy, and it kind of sets up the potential for a sequel to Sorcerer of Thorns. I'm not sure if it's actually happening, but if it did, I would definitely be interested in checking that out. Another sequel, or well, a sequel that I read, which concluded a duology, was Heart of the Sun Warrior, which is by Sulin Tan. I enjoyed the sequel. It's not too surprising given that I had a lot of fun reading the first book in the series, even though I had quibbles about the pacing and the amount of plot that had been crammed into that one. Since my expectations are a little bit tempered, especially given that I knew there was going to be some love triangle angst in this one, I think it helped with my overall opinion of this book being as positive as it is. The pacing in this one felt much more on point with what I had expected from the first book, and I like that this one has more mythology in this one and also still incorporates sort of the consequences of the actions taken in the first. I didn't love every single direction that the story went in, but I did have fun following Xingyin and her companions on a new series of adventures. And since I knew to anticipate that happening, it also didn't bother me that we kind of went from one to the next to the next. There was also an overarching plot, which I think held it all together really well. Overall, things wrapped up really satisfying, at least for me. As to the love triangle angst, the only thing I'm going to say about it is that I personally was less bothered than I thought I would be. I don't know why, but for some reason it didn't quite affect me as much as I thought it was going to in this book. This book definitely felt like a shoujo fantasy anime, and I liked being entertained and surprised and caught up in the action with Xingyin and the other characters, so I'm glad I finally finished the duology. The next book I read is a new release called Thief, Liar, Lady by D.L. Soria. Unfortunately, this one was also a disappointment for me. I thought it was just an okay read overall. It felt like every aspect of the story, the plot, the characters, the relationships, were underdeveloped, and then the pacing felt like it was a little bit all over the place. It would sometimes be like really action-packed and then it would get really, really slow. I also just wasn't fond of the way magic was used to manipulate other characters. Even though it fits in with the story, it just made me a little uncomfortable at times. Just parts of it, not all of it, just parts of it. It's not one I can personally recommend, although I will say that it did read really quick. The next book I read was The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren, and I was really excited about this one because the main character, Fizzy Chen, is in The Soulmate Equation, and I had loved her in that book, so I really wanted to see her love story, and honestly, it was such a delight. This is one of those rare books that made me laugh out loud, while also making me very emotional and giving me some very deep feelings. I love the way it celebrated romance and love and fandom and the joy of falling in love and being being loved by someone for who you truly are. There was definitely some drama here because there's a reality TV show aspect to it, but I was living for it and I thoroughly enjoyed the time I spent reading this one, so I can highly recommend checking it out. Next, I picked up Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, and to be honest with you, at the very beginning I was a little skeptical and kind of concerned that I wasn't going to enjoy this as much as other people have. Like, I don't know, it took me a while to get really into the story. But this book was super charming. It was a cozy little fantasy read, and I am so here for that. The reason why I felt worried at the beginning was that it took me a while to warm up to our main character, Emily Wilde, and also to the narrative style that the author chose to employ in telling this story. I love that it leans into the fairy lore and the whimsy of that and the sort of danger of that as well. I like that it treats that as an academic area of study. And I love that it felt like a modern fairy tale. I was eventually just really lost in the magic and the whimsy of it, and I loved being led down the path by our educated and often blunt narrator, Emily Wilde. It was a lovely fantasy book that entertained me, and it felt unique, and I genuinely adore this, and I am excited to read, honestly, I'm very excited to read the sequel. I also picked up The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa, and I actually listened to the audiobook narrated by Cassandra Campbell for this, and it was lovely. I've known about this book for years because of my friend Rachel, but I finally picked it up and I'm glad I did. This is another like slice of life story. It is about a housekeeper and a professor and the housekeeper's son and the bond they share. And it's lovely because it really focuses on friendship and support and found family. It also talks about mathematics, which is not a topic that I thought I would find interesting. I loved how heartwarming this felt. It was just nice to see sort of this supportive, encouraging relationship and regard that all these three had for each other. And I love that the author was able to tell this story in a way that, you know, just kept your attention, and was easy to devour. So I enjoyed that. Next, for Family Book Club, we read The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and I honestly can't remember if I had read any of his other books. I might have, I don't know, but it felt like I was reading his work for the first time. It's really readable, and the way he's written it and the narrator he chooses for the book definitely made it a very difficult sort of emotional roller coaster reading experience for me. It had me reflecting on human nature and circumstances and secrets and love and fear and shame. It had me really like angry and really sad at a lot of different parts of the story. And I honestly didn't know how the story was going to play out by the end of it and how it would stick the landing. I did feel like it was solid and it felt real, but also it kind of hurt my soul a little bit, honestly. It was painful and it was heartbreaking and heart-wrenching and also anger-inducing, but, you know, I also couldn't set it down once I'd started reading it, so there's that. I then read one of my favorite romance reads of the year, and that is In the Weeds by B.K. Borison. I love this so much. I'd gone into this one with pretty high expectations, given that I had met the two main characters in this one in the previous book, Love Light Farms, and I particularly loved the love interest Beckett Porter. And it's a book that exceeded my expectations. It was lovely to be back at Love Light Farms, and I enjoyed getting to know Evie and Beckett a little bit more and to sort of see them as individuals and to see the whole of them instead of just, you know, parts the way we did in the first book. I just really liked reading about them and watching them fall in love and also sort of figure out what they really wanted out of their lives. I will say the miscommunication trope is in this one, and that normally isn't my cup of tea, but for some reason in this one it didn't really bother me, and I think it's because I felt so deeply for the characters and their struggles, and I really felt like I could relate and understand where they were coming from. I think that's actually in big part why this romance works so well for me. There were aspects of Beckett's struggles that I could relate to and aspects of Evie's that I could relate to, and that just meant that the whole story felt really relatable to me, and I was so personally invested in the outcome of their story. So yeah, In the Weeds was so good. Then I read Like Water for Chocolate, which is by Laura Esquivel, and the reason I read it was because my friend Rachel and I went to see the American Ballet Theater performance of it during their summer season, and that was beautiful, by the way. The ballet was beautiful and captures the spirit of the story so well. The book didn't end up working quite as well for me. I felt like the flow of the story wasn't really my cup of tea. I don't know if that has to do with the translation or if it really is the way that it was written. The plot also kind of fell flat, even though it was technically focusing on like complicated relationships and big family struggles, basically. And I also just didn't feel anything more than a basic sympathy for the characters and what they were going through. That said, I do think like the inclusion of the recipes every month as a framework was interesting. It also made me want to eat a lot, but other than that, honestly, this book was not my cup of tea. And then I read The Moonlight Blade, which is a YA fantasy book that has some Filipino lore in it. It's by Tessa Barbosa. This has very familiar tropes that are used in a lot of fantasy books, both in the characters and in the setting and the plot. And the beginning was a little bit slow for me. It was very much because of the setup. It took until like 2/3 maybe of the book for things to really pick up. And even though it took that long, and even though I could kind of guess at where the plot was going, I still found it interesting to watch everything unfold in the end. I kind of just wish I'd had a deeper connection to the characters, because I feel like that would have made a difference in my overall regard for the story. I did enjoy the nods to Filipino culture in it, and the writing is pretty solid. I may continue the series, I'm not sure about that yet, but yeah, this was pretty like a pretty good, solid like YA fantasy read. Nothing to stand out. And then I read Mixed Signals by B.K. Borison. This is the 3rd installment in the Lovelight Farms companion novel series, and I enjoyed it so much. It was delightful. The premise itself felt like it was out of a rom-com, and I loved all the little dates that Caleb and Layla went on. Caleb is the sweetest, and Layla was a darling, and those two together were so sweet and so cute, and I just loved watching them develop their relationship and fall in love. Plus, it was, again, nice to be back in the town of Wilde and to be around such familiar faces and a familiar crowd. I love the small town setting and the cozy vibes, and B.K. Borison really delivers on that and the romance in this one, so it was also enjoyable. And then I read The Unsinkable, Greta James, which is by Jennifer E. Smith. I have read very many of her YA books. This is her first adult book, and I really enjoyed it. It is a story that involves the main character grappling with something very personal, and in this one, Greta is struggling with her mother's death and her relationship with music as a professional in that industry, and her estranged relationship with her dad. I love that it takes place over the course of a week on an Alaskan cruise, where Greta is joining the cruise with her dad and some of their family friends. And I like that she ends up finding herself challenged and comforted and then recognized in a very real and human way. Her character journey was really compelling. Just to see her growth from who she was at the start and who she was at the end was really cool. It also made me want to go on an Alaskan cruise because it sounded really fun. And I loved too the music aspects to it, some publishing aspects to it, and also the character relationships. This was a really good, really compelling read that got me all emotional and deep in my feels, and I'm so glad that I was finally able to check it out. I also read One Italian Summer by Rebecca Searle. Like many other readers who have talked about this book, it made me want to plan a trip to Italy, specifically to Positano and maybe a couple of other coastline cities. I can totally imagine taking a trip and seeing some of the sights and visiting some of the places she mentioned in this book and having some of the food. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Lauren Graham, which was fantastic. It's not necessarily a new favorite, but I do find stories where characters are exploring their grief or working through it interesting, because I feel like everyone experiences that differently, and I like seeing those different experiences sort of tackled on page. A lot of the sentiment that the characters express in this one I felt very deeply about. I just didn't feel super personally connected with our main character, Katie. In fact, there were times when I just found her really frustrating, and I think that affected my overall regard for this book. It was enjoyable, not a new favorite, but I'm glad I read it. The second to the last book that I read was Well Traveled by Jen DeLuca. This is part of the Well Met series. I was pretty confident I was gonna like it because I've enjoyed all the other books in the series, and I was right. I enjoyed getting to know Lulu and Dex a little better. They're more secondary characters in the other books, so it was kind of nice to be in closer proximity to them. I liked watching their relationship come into its own, and even though miscommunication was again a part of the plot here, it didn't really bug me as much as it normally would, because it felt like it made sense in the situation they were both in. It was also nice just to see so many familiar faces. Like, we got a lot of cameos from other characters in the series, and I really enjoyed that. And of course, I love the Ren Fair aspect of it too. That's always been one of my favorite things about the series itself. So I'm glad I finally got around to reading it. I really enjoyed this new romance in this world. It was definitely a fun read. And the last book I read in the month of June was Normal by Danielle Pearl, which was a reread that I did with my friend Rachel. I'm not always in the mood for angsty romance, so it's very rare that I will gravitate towards reading that, and this one I wouldn't have read originally to begin with if Rachel hadn't recommended it, but revisiting it was really good because I felt like the story came to life so well with Danielle Pearl's storytelling style. I got really interested and invested in the characters, especially their emotional journeys, considering what trauma they've been through in the past, and it was so good. And even though it frustrates me that it ends where it ends, and if you've read it, you know what I mean, like, I still found the experience of rereading and revisiting this world ultimately heartbreaking, of course, for all that our characters have been through, but also, like, I was definitely invested from start to end. There you have it. Those are all the books that I read in June, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!